What we need to make the waistband today is essentially the band roll canvas linked, your fabric, and silecia. But if you want to make some trousers later, then I suggest buying at least 2 meters of band roll canvas, unless you want to make quite a few samples, in which case buy more. If you want side tab adjusters or side adjusters, then you'll also need buckles, also linked. Fabric for now can still be whatever you can get your hands on, but calico works fine. Nothing with much or preferably any stretch along the warp and the weft. I'm using a cheap wool from the dead stock and or factory rejects seller. Woolcrest in Hackney, if you're interested. £5 to £10 a metre for kinda decent might be wool fabric. We're going to give our sample a simple side seam. On fabric, chalk out a 30 to 40 cm by 20-ish cm rectangle. The rectangle needs to be perpendicular to the selvage of the fabric, the kinda overlock side, because this is the top of the trouser, so that the rest of the leg, which isn't present today, can actually fit. Mark halfway through it. Mark 3 cm down from the top edge all the way across. This is the inlay. From the inlay, mark a point 8 cm down the halfway line, and either side of that on the inlay line, mark 1 cm, and join the 8 cm point to the two 1 cm points. Finally, on one of the sides, mark 2.5 cm behind the centre line for the side seam inlay. The one with the inlay is the back trouser, while the other is the front trouser. Cut the two out and make a mark on the face-up sides and face-down sides if you're cutting two at once. This shows us which one is the wrong side, so we can always put the right sides and the correct pieces together. You will also need to cut the waistband. That will be the length of the two pieces, plus maybe a little. I'm being arbitrary because it's a sample, but it does need to be at least 6 cm wide. Grain-wise, it's cutting along perpendicular to the grain, so it's cut down the leg. We should usually mark the grain arrows as a reminder. They'll all be pointing in the same direction. We only need as much band roll canvas as we have waistband fabric. To make the side tab adjuster pattern, I start from a central point and move 18 cm one way and 11 the other. Then go about 3 cm horizontally either side of the start point. This measurement changes with the width of your buckle, and in short, it's the buckle's width plus half a centimetre. Draw perpendicular lines from the 18 and 11 cm lines. Make sure they're centred, and on the long side, it's 5.5 cm wide, and on the shorter side, it's 4.5 cm wide. From the thin point, draw a curve to the lines of your ends. You don't need to draw the curve on both sides, since we're going to fold it in half and then cut it out, though you could make it more angular if you'd like. I largely suggest making a paper pattern that you can reuse constantly rather than drafting a new one every time. Place the pattern vertically on the fabric, so long side the same as the waistband. Trace around the pattern and trace the line at the slimmest point. Cut it out, and we'll split them in two at this point as well, always marking the wrong sides. Why you'd want belt loops is anyone's guess, but I suppose you ought to know anyway. You are deciding how many loops you want. The normal number is 7, and mine are 5 by 10 centimeters. I marked the grain line onto them to illustrate that the long side is parallel to the trouser leg. You can always change the length and width of the waistband, the width of your belt. The width of the loops is something that you can change too, so have at it. Always chalk the wrong sides, and I'm opening up the two pieces to show that I have two pieces. and I'm marking the wrong sides on both. The right side safely preserved on the inside. You also need to cut the lining. These could be silecia or another kind of lining like silk if, say, you enjoy going commando when wearing suits. The waistband lining is 6 cm wide and the length of the waistband, and the curtain will be twice as tall as you want the curtain to hang. This is also as long as the waistband plus 20 cm, more than that if convenient. You'll know how much more you'll want once you know what's going on with it later. I know I'm cutting significantly more than I need here, but since I largely use the same silecia and the same heights and widths for all trousers, I can keep these bits safe and use them on a later pair of trousers, possibly negating the need to cut more later. Just being the most economical that we can be. Firstly, mark stitch the waistline and inlay, except we're doing one leg, so you could just baste along the lines, although I have two so that I can show side tabs and belt loops today. Line up the two trouser pieces. Place the one with the inlay right side up and lay the other right side down onto it. Line the top piece along the basted seam 2.5 cm from the edge. It is superfluous in this situation, but it helps to learn how seams will fit together. Baste the seam down. Again, maybe superfluously. Baste it close to 1 cm from the top side, from the edge with no inlay, and from the inlay marks. We don't really want to catch it in the machine stitch. Baste it densely enough to keep the seam in place, to keep the two together while they're being machined, basically. Machine them together with a 1 cm seam allowance from the inlay mark, so 1 cm in from the front trouser. We don't need to back tack either side. Iron the seam open, iron it just flat to begin with, before opening up the two pieces and splitting the seam allowance to either side. We have our waistband and band roll canvas of about equal lengths. On the waistband, mark 1 cm in from the edge on the wrong side. With the band roll canvas, place the side which doesn't have the bias canvas up against that line, such that the bias canvas is on top of the main canvas. Sew it down the middle of the overlap of the canvas and the band, so with a 0.5 cm seam allowance. As we sew, after we've started and gotten the needle in, we want to make sure that the waistband is taut against the canvas. So it bits at a time, make sure the canvas is lined up to the chalk, and hold on to it a little further back, holding them together so that while not too tight, the two are even together, and there's no need to back tack on either side. We'll fold the waistband over the canvas. Simplest way is to just place it canvas side down, hold the canvas and pull the fabric over it, ironing as we go. Place the iron on the first little bit, then position the next 15 or 20 centimeters of waistband over the canvas before moving the iron. Moving the iron off and then bringing it down vertically, sliding it over the positioned section, moving on to the next and the next until it's all done. Having finished the whole length, the one-step method being to baste the bottom of the fabric to the bias tape along the canvas about halfway through it. If we could, we might like to overlock along this edge, but if not, then settle for trimming any excess beyond the canvas. An alternative method, where we use tailor's soap, is to place the fabric onto the work surface, holding it down and pushing the canvas into the crease. Using the iron to begin holding it down, move along, forcing the canvas into the fabric 15 to 20 centimeters at a time until the whole waistband is creased. Flip the waistband over and rub tailor's soap on the canvas and on the bias tape. Fold the fabric back onto the canvas and begin drawing the iron down from the crease and leaving and steaming the waistband. Proceed by smoothing the canvas down vertically, following with the iron, steaming the soap into place. While the soap is still holding the fabric to the waistband, we'll give it a stitch down the middle of the bias tape. We want to check about halfway through that the fabric isn't being pulled, and if it is, or regardless, I usually do it anyway, hold the very ends together to make sure it doesn't pull any more. Check that the waistband is acceptable, that it hasn't pulled too much, and we'll move on. On the front, chalk on the waistline so that we can see the whole of where the waistband needs to be lined up. Line the bottom of the waistband up against the marked stitch / basted line on the trouser. Baste the waistband in place there. They're being sewn together right at the point that the light canvas meets the heavy canvas, so it's a 1 cm seam allowance. It's important that we don't catch any of the heavy canvas or the seam won't fold open properly. We still need to be as close as possible though, so that the seam is nice and clean. Again, we don't need to back tack on either side today. Iron the seam open. Iron it flat first, then fold it open, ironing the inlay downwards and the seam allowance up, which will suddenly be quite difficult if we caught the waistband canvas in the stitch. Firstly, we'll make the side tab adjusters. They're going to be folded in half and stitched on the curve with a 1/2 cm seam allowance. On the long tab, you'll also close the slim end, being sure to fold open the seam allowance. Before folding them inside out, iron open the seam allowances so that when you do fold them out, the seam allowances won't bunch to either side. To fold them out, we might like the help of a knitting needle, but instead I have a convenient chopstick. Then iron them flat and symmetrical. On the seam side, we should cut away some of the fabric so that it sits more neatly and more flat. Fold it so that the creases are touching and cut a nondescript amount of the seam away. We're going to fold the tips over and iron them in place, making sure that they're symmetrical. To do it consistently, take a point of the tab and fold that to the middle in the seam. The fold will be to the point on the other side of the tab. For this, we need to use plenty of steam and heat, and we might like to use table soap as well, just leaving the iron on the tab to dry out the grease so that it stays there. Then the other point, move that to the same place as the first, but also making the seam across the top vertical and in line with the seam along the tab. Do it the same for both and they should come out very similar. We could spend months, years, like probably centuries trying to get it exact, but that's just inefficient. So if they pass the initial smell test, then they're good. The more we look at them, the less symmetrical they're going to look. Don't stare. When sewing them onto the trouser, the buckle should be centered on the side seam, but the exact height of the tabs is up to you and whomever the trousers are going to belong to. Completely on the waistband, half and half, 3/4 on the waistband. Do note though that the short tab points towards the front, so you're pulling the tab backwards to tighten the waist, and the long tab is pointing towards your rear. I'd forgotten this when I did it, but kind of doesn't matter, but the long tab should be on the side with the inlay on it. You're best beginning with a short tab because it's fixed and you can easily determine the halfway point of the buckle and line that up to the side seam. When you fix the tabs, you'll baste them in place first and then you could fill or prick stitch them. Or both. You need to prick stitch across the seam regardless because you kind of can't fell it. I would and did and will continue to chalk out where that particular prick stitch is going to go so that my other fells and or pricks don't go beyond it and I have a straight line to guide me. Get them basted on before you start sewing them down. It's best to use our silk thread, but I have trousers with side tabs that I just used my polyester thread and they are fine. We kind of do need to finish these before we get the lining on, so that we can stitch through as much as possible and anchoring them in the toughest way possible without them showing through the lining. We begin by attaching the curtain. The curtain is doubled up so that the fraying ends are secured in the waistband and under the fly bits. This one is a continuous piece all around the waistband. Almost all. Align the curtain at the front of the trouser. It'd usually be hidden under some part of the fly and or against the folded up portion of the waistband and the side pockets. Begin to baste it to the trouser onto the seam allowance of the waistband. It would be advantageous to also stitch through the canvas, but that's not wholly necessary. But definitely don't catch through the fabric. We could take it out having replaced it with a cross stitch, but I won't. Just keep basting all the way along. If we want this to be a permanent stitch to hold it in place, then we just need to do an extra stitch on top of every other baste, or every baste. Make a chalk mark about halfway through the back piece, the one with the inlay. We'll put a pleat there. When we get to the chalk mark, which is where a dart would be, we'll just create a small pleat facing the centre back, a little more than 2 centimeters deep. At the back, we can create a box pleat as well. So create another 2 centimeter pleat facing the outside. Then for the box pleat, which will be on the centre back, just mirror that. The openings of the pleat should be touching. You don't have any trouser to baste that onto? You could leave it flapping about, or cut it. I'll defer to you. But, of course, you just keep basting on an actual trouser. Like I said, to fix it in place, you could fold the waistband out of the way and machine it, or use your cross stitch to fix it to the canvas. Don't go through the waistband material though. It doesn't need to be so dense or pretty, just functional. But again, if our baste along the seam allowance is strong enough, we can just use that. To attach the waistband lining, press a 1 centimeter seam in on both sides. Lay the waistband lining onto the waistband. We could baste the top or the bottom first. Either way, we want the lining to sit a few millimeters below the top of the waistband. As we baste the first side, we want the waistband to be curved in our hand so that it automatically builds in ease. Whether you did the top or the bottom baste first, we can move the seam to be as consistent as possible next to the top of the waistband. Starting with the top, we could obviously just move the height of the seam, but when we start from the bottom, we can still just move the seam. Might be a pain with the crease, but we can still change it if necessary. Because many of the waistband features can't be here, given it's not a whole trouser, we literally only have to fill the waistband. Usually we want to use silk, but normal waxed thread is fine for today. Moor the thread at one end and start the stitch. Along the top, we're still making sure the seam is a few mil from the top of the waistband and still curved over our hand. We don't need to catch much more than the fabric on the inside. It's fine to sew through the canvas, but we mustn't sew through the outside of the fabric. Along the bottom, it's still curved over our hand. We're stitching the lining to the curtain. Honestly, if you were able to sew through the front fabric, that would be impressive, but we still want to avoid it. Having fastened both sides, we can remove the basting, and we're done. Fold them in half and sew them together with a centimetre seam allowance, making it easier to flip them inside out. To flip them, starting when we sew it closed, we can pull an excess of thread out and lay it into the loop, folding the loop over the thread, back tacking at the top and bottom, of course. Or we can use tweezers to grasp one end and push it through the cylinder. Before flipping though, iron the seam open so that when you flip it inside out, the seam will be open and not bulking to one side. Sew the loop closed like normal, preserving the thread sticking out at the end. We can then gently pull the threads through to flip it right side out. Then be sure to give it some welly to get it flat. At some point before we flip it, we might like to cut some of the 1 centimetre seam allowance away so that it's less bulky and easier to flip. Mark where you want your loops to sit on the trouser and baste them in place. Line the tops of the belt loops against the waistline just like we would the waistband. Then attach the waistband as normal. When you press the waistband seam open, you're pressing the belt loop end up into the waistband, and on the outside, pressing it down a little before folding it back up over the waistband. On the outside of the trouser, we're pressing the loop downwards, so just where they're tacked still. We're going to fix the belt loop in place about 1 centimetre below the waistband. Fasten your thread somewhere discreet before tacking the first side of the belt loop to the trouser. Prick stitch along the belt loop. We'll barely get 3 in there to tack the other side before discreetly re-securing the thread. Fold the belt loop up now. We want to have some ease in the loop so that we can actually fit a belt in there. Give it some space and just baste it in place. This way we can see whether it's straight before we finish it. Press the top of the loop down over the waistband, tack it to the canvas. Just stitch it over and over on both sides to hold it in place there. Then, like the adjusters, next step is the lining. If you want a centre back belt loop, details on that will be in the future trouser construction video. As you can no doubt tell, I couldn't quite be bothered to do it all of it, so I just did enough to illustrate what you need to do if you wanted belt loops. This step is also slipped in before attaching the waistband, but first you need to cut your pocket. You can make it as big or as small as you like, add a centimetre on both sides though, as we're going to French seam it closed. The back is also going to be around 2 centimetres higher than the bottom. So if I wanted to put my oyster card in it, then we'd need to cut two pieces, one 12 by 9 centimetres and one 14 by 9 centimetres. So think about the dimensions you want and add 2 centimetres to both of those, plus another 2 centimetres on the top for one of the pieces. We also need to cut a facing. Cut it with the grain of the trouser, and it should be 1 centimetre slimmer than the silecia to not add bulk to the French seam. That should be, and it should be, say, 5 centimetres tall. Lay the facing onto the taller silecia with the tops lined up and a ½ centimetre of the silecia bleeding out of each side to avoid folding it into the French seam. Fold up ½ centimetre at the bottom and sew that down one way or another. Put the two sides together with the facing on the outside and the short side lined up to the edge without the facing, and machine them with a ½ centimetre seam allowance. No back tacking, so that we can get a seam allowance to sew it to the trouser. Fold it inside out to French the seam. However, this time mark 1 centimetre below the top of the shorter piece. Start and end on those points, back tacking this time. Yes, do back tacking this time. Pull the non-back tacked pieces of stitching down to our back tacked 1 centimetre point, and we've got a nice flappy seam allowance. Check the width of the pocket, so between the French back tacked seams. Mark where you want to put your bag onto the trouser. I suggest starting at the trouser front's midpoint and going back from there. Hang on. Mark where you want to mark where you want to put your bag onto your trouser. I suggest starting at the trouser front midpoint and going towards the side seam from there. Where you want to mark is only between where the pocket bag opens, so not the cumulative centimetre that are French seams. Armed with these marked points, we're attaching the waistband, but you're skipping this marked section. Be sure to back tack both sides so that it doesn't come off so easily. Having pressed open the seam of the waistband, line the pocket up to the open section and machine the short flappy bit to the waistband inlay, moving the trouser out of the way. It's about this point that you could introduce a flap or button tab if you wanted to. Fold the waistband out of the way and sew the top of the pocket to the waistband seam. With the pocket fixed in place, we might like to bar tack each side and prick stitch along the opening. From here, you're attaching the lining, and you just want to keep in mind that you don't want to go through both layers of the pocket. There are other good, likely even better methods of putting in the fob pocket, so you might like to look into that. Next is going to be the zip, and then the trousers. And there should be a whole new trouser series video of yet again improved video and construction quality.